If you have freckles, you've probably heard the same explanation your whole life. It's an Irish thing, a Scottish thing, something passed down from pale, sun-starved ancestors somewhere in the British Isles. That explanation isn't wrong exactly. It's just nowhere close to the whole story. Because the DNA behind your freckles connects to a piece of biology far older than Ireland, far older than Europe, and in one particular case, far older than our own species. This is where freckles actually come from, and why scientists now believe this trait may have evolved not once, but at least twice, in two different kinds of humans, separated by tens of thousands of years. For most people, the story of freckles starts and ends with ancestry. Red-headed, freckled, easily sunburned, the classic image of Celtic heritage, tracing back to Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia. It's a simple, tidy explanation, and it does capture something real. Freckling really is more common in populations with lighter pigmentation, and it really does cluster heavily in Northern European ancestry. But treating it as one single ethnic trait, tied to one bloodline, misses almost everything interesting about how freckles actually work at the genetic level. Freckles are not simply spots of extra pigment scattered randomly across skin. Scientifically, they're called ephelides, small clusters where melanin becomes concentrated in specific patches, without any increase in the number of pigment-producing cells underneath. Unlike moles, freckles fade in winter and darken with direct sun exposure, meaning your genes and the sun are working together in real time to produce the pattern you see on your skin. The gene most strongly tied to freckling is called MC1R, and it's the same gene responsible for red hair. MC1R controls a switch inside pigment cells, deciding how much of two different pigments your body produces, dark brown-black eumelanin or lighter red-yellow pheomelanin. Certain MC1R variants tilt that switch strongly toward the lighter pigment, which produces red or strawberry blonde hair, fair skin that burns easily, and a strong tendency toward freckling. But MC1R turned out to be only the beginning of this story, not the whole thing. In 2013, a research team publishing in the journal Cell identified a separate genetic switch involved in freckling, a variant sitting inside a gene called IRF4. This variant doesn't work the way MC1R does. Instead, it sits in a regulatory region that controls how strongly a completely different pathway activates the enzyme responsible for building melanin in the first place. Later studies added even more genes to the list: ASIP, BNC2, TYR, OCA2, each one nudging pigment production in a slightly different way. Freckling, it turns out, isn't controlled by one gene with one clean answer. It's the combined output of an entire small network of genes, each contributing a piece of the final pattern. Researchers studying this network in Spain took the science one step further, testing whether these genetic markers could actually predict, from a DNA sample alone, whether a given person was likely to have freckles at all. Working with more than 400 individuals, roughly half freckled and half not, the team built a prediction model using 5 key genetic variants across those same core genes. The model performed well enough to be genuinely useful, correctly separating freckled from non-freckled individuals at a meaningfully high rate, confirming that freckling is one of the more genetically predictable visible traits we carry, once you know which handful of switches to check. That network also reveals something the simple Celtic ancestry story completely misses. When researchers ran the same freckle-associated genetic markers through population studies outside Northern Europe, in Spain, and separately in a large study of Japanese women, the results didn't line up cleanly. In the Spanish population, the same core genes, MC1R, IRF4, ASIP, and BNC2, showed up clearly, consistent with other European studies. But in the Japanese dataset, several of those same freckle markers were barely present at all, some of them almost entirely absent from the population's genetic variation. Freckling still occurred. It just wasn't being driven by the same genetic machinery. This is the first real crack in the myth. Freckling isn't one trait with one European origin story. It's a visible outcome that different populations appear to have arrived at through different genetic routes, shaped by their own separate histories of sun exposure, migration, and local adaptation. Most researchers believe the underlying pressure driving all of this is the same one that shaped pale skin generally. As early humans migrated out of equatorial Africa and pushed into higher latitudes, sunlight became scarcer and weaker. Less ultraviolet radiation meant less natural vitamin D synthesis through the skin, a nutrient the human body needs to build strong bones and support a functioning immune system. Populations that evolved lighter pigmentation, allowing more UV to penetrate, gained an advantage in vitamin D production at the cost of more sun sensitivity, more burning, and in some lineages, more freckling, along with a higher long-term risk of skin damage. It was a trade, not a flaw. Better vitamin D synthesis in a low-light world, purchased with skin that reacted more visibly and sometimes more dangerously to the sun whenever it did appear. This is also why freckles are not the same thing as the darker, more permanent age spots that show up later in life. A separate study out of the Netherlands, tracking thousands of adults over 60, found that many of these same pigmentation genes, IRF4, MC1R, and BNC2 among them, also predict how many pigmented spots someone accumulates simply from decades of ordinary sun exposure. In other words, the same genetic dial that gave you freckles as a child may quietly keep influencing your skin's relationship with sunlight for the rest of your life. Picture a small group of early modern humans, tens of thousands of years ago, moving steadily north out of Africa, following game and coastlines into landscapes with shorter winters and weaker sun. Their children are born a little paler than their parents, their grandchildren paler still. Nobody in that group understands why. There is no concept of genes, no concept of vitamin D, no concept of pigment pathways switching on and off inside their skin. There is only survival, generation after generation, in places where the old advantages of deep pigmentation no longer mattered, and new advantages, invisible ones, quietly took their place instead. Freckles, for some of those lineages, became a visible byproduct of a body chasing sunlight it wasn't getting enough of. Here's the twist that changes what freckles actually represent. Modern humans were not the only hominins working through this exact problem. In 2007, researchers analyzing ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal remains in Spain and Italy identified a variant in the very same MC1R gene, a mutation that appeared to disrupt the receptor's function in a way strikingly similar to the human redhead variant. When the team tested the effect of this Neanderthal mutation in laboratory cell cultures, it behaved exactly the way scientists would expect a loss-of-function pigmentation mutation to behave, consistent with lighter skin and a shift toward reddish pigmentation. This Neanderthal mutation was not inherited from modern humans, and modern humans didn't inherit it from Neanderthals either. It was a completely separate, independent change, arising on its own, deep inside a different branch of the human family tree entirely, at a different genetic address within the very same gene. In other words, at least twice in the history of hominins, in two separate species, separated by tens of thousands of years, and an evolutionary split that happened long before either lineage existed in its modern form, the same basic genetic solution appeared. Reduce pigmentation, shift the melanin balance, cope with a world that had less sunlight to offer. Neanderthals living in Ice Age Europe may well have had pale skin, reddish hair, and freckled skin of their own, not because they inherited it from us, and not because we inherited it from them, but because the same evolutionary pressure produced the same rough answer twice. This isn't just an academic curiosity anymore either. Freckle-associated genetic markers have become useful tools in an unexpected field, forensic science. Researchers have built DNA-based prediction models using the same genes behind this video, MC1R, IRF4, BNC2, and others, to estimate whether an unidentified individual likely had freckles, purely from a genetic sample left at a scene. The same biological code that once helped ancient populations survive weaker sunlight is now helping modern investigators build a picture of someone's appearance from nothing more than a few strands of DNA. So if you have freckles, this is what your genes are actually telling you. Not simply that your ancestors came from Ireland or Scotland or anywhere in particular. They're telling you that somewhere in your family's deep genetic past, one or more small mutations reshaped how your skin handles sunlight, in a pattern so useful, so repeatable, that a different species of humans stumbled onto a version of the exact same solution, tens of thousands of years before your own ancestors ever existed. The freckles on your skin are not a flaw, and they're not simply decoration. They're a visible record of one of the oldest, most repeated experiments evolution ever ran, tested more than once, in more than one kind of human, against the same relentless problem of surviving somewhere the sun didn't reach as far. Somewhere in that long chain of migration, adaptation, and repeated genetic trial and error, a version of your own skin was shaped by the exact same pressure that once shaped a Neanderthal living in a cave in Ice Age Spain tens of thousands of years before either of you existed. Different species, different mutation, same sky, same shortage of light, same rough answer, written twice into two different genomes by two different branches of the same family tree. The next time you look in the mirror and see freckles scattered across your skin, you're not looking at something random. You're looking at one of the oldest recurring patterns in human evolution, still visible, still being written, one sunny afternoon at a time.